Okay, welcome everyone to our special forum today, training forum on Article 5. I am Julia Wharton. I am the National Field and Programs Director, and I am thrilled to be with you all today. Chris Ullman is our National President, and Chris is going to facilitate this conversation. So Chris?
Thank you, Julia, and thank you everyone who has joined us today. We're here today to talk about the dangers of an Article 5 Convention for Proposing Amendments, sometimes referred to as a convention of states by its supporters, and you may have also heard the term CON or Constitutional Convention. And some people say that a call for a CON or a constitutional convention is different than an Article 5, but going back and reading some of the things from the 1970s and 80s, those who were calling for a CON to consider a balanced budget amendment were actually using the Article 5 Convention for Proposing Amendment language in the Constitution for that. So that CON is basically the same thing that we're talking about here. You know, Phyllis first wrote about this issue, the CON, in 39 years ago, in December of 1984. What she said at that time, at the bottom of her Phyllis Schlafly report, talking about what the balanced budget amendment proponents were pushing, she said, Eagle Forum has been the grassroots guardian of the U.S. Constitution since 1972. We have protected it against the powerful and well-financed efforts of those who try to amend it with pleasing words to achieve radical goals. We urge our friends to work energetically for a balanced budget amendment, but to oppose a CON or an Article 5 convention because no cause, however worthy, justifies risking our great U.S. Constitution. And those words are true today. While we agree with a lot of the problems that are pointed out by the people who are advocating for an Article 5 convention, the fact that our federal government is out of control and not following the rules that it's supposed to follow, we think that their solution is not the right approach and is actually very damaging and dangerous to our Constitution. You know, Phyllis taught me another thing, and that is that it's possible to work with our friends on a lot of issues and still be opposed on a couple issues that we have strong feelings about. And it's never wrong to oppose your friends when you're doing the right thing. But we have to remember that a lot of the people who are advocating for an Article 5 convention don't understand the dangers. And that's why we wanted to have this Zoom meeting today. The problems that we're facing as a country are real, but we need to make sure that the solutions that we're advocating for are good and proper solutions and ones that don't put our great Constitution at risk. So let me introduce who our panelists for today are. We have Judy Kaler from California, and she tracks the COS amendments in all the states and has works with Eagle Forum and sends out alerts every time this comes up in a different state. So she'll be talking to us. Janine Hansen from Nevada, our Eagle leader there, who also follows this issue very closely and has written about it for years, will talk to us, as will Gail Ruzicka, our Utah Eagle Forum chairman, another expert on this. Orleen as well from California, who has written extensively on this, an Eagle Forum leader there. And then Elaine Donnelly will talk to us. And Elaine does the Center for Military Readiness, but she also hooked us up with Professor Woodruff, who wrote an excellent law review article, really showing the flaws in the arguments of the pro-COS side. So he wasn't able to join us, and Elaine's going to conclude us by filling in the gaps and kind of talking to us a little bit about the summary article that we will share with you guys later on this issue. So I've got, in true Phyllis Eagle Forum fashion, a little stopwatch here, and I'm going to ask Judy to go first.
As I was saying, this is a heated issue between globalists and those of us who want to maintain our existing Constitution and national sovereignty. It cuts across party lines. And even though proponents of the issue claim massive support, most people have never heard of an Article 5 convention or convention of states for that matter. Ask the person next to you at the grocery store. Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution is only one short paragraph. It provides two ways of amending our Constitution. Number one, Congress proposes amendments by 2/3 of each house, and this was used for our existing 27 amendments. Or two, Congress calls a convention for proposing amendments if 2/3 of the states, that's now 34, apply for a convention by passing a resolution. Either way, Congress sends the amendments to the state legislatures or state conventions for ratification. Congress has never called a convention under Article 5. They are dangerous. No one knows what will happen at such a convention, and after it's called, it will be too late to stop it. But today, various factions are lobbying state legislatures to ask Congress to call a convention under Article 5. They use various hooks, which are proposed amendments on such appealing topics as congressional term limits, balancing the federal budget, taking money out of politics, or limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. But nothing in Article 5 limits the convention to subjects specified by state legislatures. So the subject of a state's application for a convention is nothing more than bait designed to attract specific groups of people to get them to support an Article 5 convention and to get legislators to pass their applications. The phrase convention for proposing amendments, which appears within Article 5, doesn't restrict the delegates to just proposing amendments. A constitutional convention is the highest authority in our republic, where power flows directly from we the people. And delegates to the convention, as sovereign representatives of the people, would have the self-evident right to alter or to abolish their government and set up a new one as recognized by the Declaration of Independence. We already invoked that right twice. In 1776, when we threw off the British monarchy, and in 1787, when we threw off our first constitution, the Articles of Confederation, and set up our current constitution, which created a new form of government. And a precedent was set in 1787 when the Amendments Convention, called by the states and the Continental Congress for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation, resulted in a new constitution with an easier mode of ratification. This could happen today with a third constitution, and there are at least 6 waiting in the wings for a convention to be called. Article 1, Section 8, last clause of the U.S. Constitution says Congress shall have the power to make all laws which are necessary and proper to carry into execution the powers vested by the Constitution in the government of the United States. So until the convention convenes, Congress is a major player. And there's a Congressional Research Service report in 2014 that says that Congress has traditionally laid claim to broad responsibilities in connection with the convention because the Constitution is silent on that. And that includes, it says, receiving, judging, and recording state applications. They decide which is valid, in other words, and establishing procedures to summon the convention and determining the number and selection process for the delegates. So the convention is a federal function. It's not a state function. So state legislators have no control over it except to ask Congress to call one. When those pushing for a convention assure you that the state legislatures will select delegates and hold them to oaths of obedience to the state legislature, they're making stuff up. Whether Congress provides for the election of delegates or allows them to be appointed by legislatures or selects the delegates themselves, state legislatures have no power over delegates. And since the delegates have the self-evident right to alter or abolish the existing state and federal governments, no one has power over delegates. No one knows what Congress will do about selecting delegates. There's nothing to prevent Congress from appointing themselves as delegates. And once the convention convenes, delegates will have more power than state legislatures, Congress, and the president put together. They are not subject to state laws. So these restrictions on delegates that they write into the state applications, which are very common, or in delegate laws, they're worthless. No one has the power to control delegates. So why did the framers put the convention method of Article 5 into the Constitution? Our framers all agreed that the purpose of amendments is to correct defects in the Constitution. At the 1787 convention, Anti-Federalist George Mason expressed concern that a provision of the Constitution should prove oppressive, such as slavery, the people should have the right to propose amendments if Congress refuses to propose them. But convention proponents all insist that the purpose of the convention method of Article 5 is to rein in the federal government when it usurps power. But no framer ever thought that. Mark Meckler, president of the Convention of States, claims that 2 days before the end of the convention, Mason said, "We've made a terrible mistake. We drafted this Constitution, we gave it the power to propose amendments, but we didn't give the same power to the states." And then Meckler quotes Mason as asking this question, which supposedly which resonates through this day, quote, "Are we so naive as to believe that the federal government that becomes a tyranny will ever propose amendments to restrain its own power?" But George Mason never said that, and it is the reason for being for the Convention of States organization. When Mason spoke of Congress abusing their power and becoming oppressive, he was referring to Congress's refusing to consent to amendments needed to fix defects in the Constitution. He was not referring to Congress becoming tyrannical and ignoring the existing constitutional limits on its powers. Our Constitution already limits the federal government to a handful of enumerated powers, but they ignore their limits and usurp powers they don't have. An amendment can't take away powers that the Constitution never granted Congress in the first place. What would it say? And we really mean it this time? It's the wrong tool. The Constitution isn't the problem. Amending the Constitution because the feds ignore it is like asking God to amend the 10 Commandments because the people are ignoring them. The Anti-Federalists at the convention wanted another convention so they could get rid of the Constitution they just drafted. Mason didn't sign it. Madison and Alexander Hamilton went along with adding the convention method because they wanted the Anti-Federalists to sign the Constitution, and they understood that a people always have the right to meet in convention and draft a new Constitution, whether the convention method was added to Article 5 or not. And people say, but isn't a convention of states different than a constitutional convention? No, it is a marketing tool to fool legislators into voting for applications and well-meaning people into supporting it. And I'll skip this because Chris covered some of it. And it was Phyllis Schlafly and the John Birch Society who taught conservatives that a constitutional convention was dangerous decades ago, and we could lose our Constitution if one were called. So the convention lobby simply used semantics to appeal to conservatives. This isn't a sexy issue, but it's vital we all learn about it. It underlies all the issues we care about, like right to life, Second Amendment, etc. If we lose our Constitution, those issues won't be our biggest problem. In Venezuela, once a free and prosperous nation, Hugo Chavez was able to get a Marxist communist constitution, and he did it through a constitutional convention method that was very similar to ours. We may not be following the Constitution we have now, but we can dust it off and start using it again. That is, if we don't lose it at a convention called under Article 5.
Thank you so much, Judy. That was excellent. Janine, we'd like you to speak next.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It is good to be with you. Eagle Forum has long contended that an Article 5 Constitutional Convention for proposing amendments would result in the loss of our Second Amendment right of the people to keep and bear arms. On September 21st, 2023, SJR 7 was filed with the California Secretary of State, having passed the legislature. It was an application for an Article 5 convention to, quote, affirm the federal, state, and local governments may adopt public safety regulations limiting aspects of firearms acquisition, possession, public carry, and use by individuals, and to impose as a matter of national policy the following firearm regulations and prohibitions: universal background checks as a prerequisite to purchase or acquisition of a firearm, prohibit the sale, loan, or other transfer of firearms to those under 21 years of age, a minimum waiting period after the purchase of a firearm before the firearm may be delivered to the buyer, a prohibition on the sale, loan, or transfer of assault weapons, including AR-15s and other weapons of war, to private citizens. The vote in the California State Senate was 24-11, and in the Assembly 53-17, showing overwhelming support for this anti-Second Amendment Article 5 application. This is the clearest indication we have ever had that an Article 5 convention will jeopardize the right to keep and bear arms. California is the largest population state and will be participating in any Article 5 convention and will have tremendous influence on that convention. They will lead other blue and purple states on this anti-gun rights amendment. Article 5 does not tell us how many delegates there will be or how they will be selected. Between 1973 and 1992, 22 bills were introduced in the U.S. House and 19 in the U.S. Senate that sought to establish a procedural framework that would apply to Article 5 convention. The Senate passed the Federal Constitutional Convention Procedures Act. These bills call for proportional representation of states based on the formula in the Electoral College, not one vote per state. So California, under this formula, would have tremendous influence. Phyllis Schlafly often quoted Chief Justice Warren Burger as the highest authority in the United States to ever speak out on the Constitutional Convention. He stated, "I have also repeatedly given my opinion that there is no effective way to limit or muzzle the actions of any constitutional convention. The convention could make its own rules, set its own agenda. Congress might try to limit the convention to one or issue or another, but there is no way to assure that the convention would obey. After the convention is convened, it will be too late to stop the convention if we don't like its agenda." So if we believe former Chief Justice, there would be no way to limit an Article 5 convention and no way to keep California's anti-Second Amendment application from being considered. Advocates of a convention, because of their frustration, have introduced a new way of counting Article 5 applications. In the past, it has been the assumption that the convention would be kept to a single subject. Of course, the Convention of States in their pocket guide and their mock conventions have suggested dozens of subjects that would fall under their language to impose fiscal restraints on the federal government and to limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. Certainly limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, indeed the Supreme Court decisions which have struck down restrictive gun legislation passed by states and localities, could fall under the very broad Constitution of States Article 5 application language. The American Constitution Foundation, in their study on how to achieve unlimited general constitutional convention under Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution, came up with a new way of counting as well. The AFC has linked together applications as diverse as anti-polygamy, the states, the balanced budget, applications trying to avert the Civil War, the direct election of senators, and the right to life. It is astonishing that AFC's white paper on the Article 5 General Convention of States, they combine Article 5 applications from Congress, from the states to Congress from the year 1789 up to some of the most recent Convention of States project applications in order to achieve their stated goal of a general or unlimited constitutional convention. Their new way of counting is useful in achieving the ultimate goal of an unlimited Article 5 convention. The aggregation strategy of Article 5 convention advocates is a treacherous way to bypass their own failure to achieve consensus in enough states for Congress to call an Article 5 convention. Instead, they create a counterfeit consensus through aggregation in order to achieve the liberty-destroying Article 5 convention, putting all we hold dear at risk. All of us know that Washington, D.C. is broken and corrupt, as well as many of the states. When the states ratified the 16th Amendment, allowing direct taxation, the income tax, and the 17th Amendment, direct election of senators, the states destroyed the founders' constitutional separation of power between states and the federal government. Through federal grants and mandates to the states, counties, cities, and school districts, the federal government controls and manipulates the states and local governments. States like Wyoming receive up to 56% of their state revenue from the federal government. Some other examples are Alaska, 50%, Arizona, 47%, Idaho, 41%, Michigan, 38%, Connecticut is the lowest at 31%. No balanced budget amendment can ever be achieved until the red and blue states reject federal funding in their mandates. 8 red states dominate the top 10 states receiving the largest percentage of federal money. No state delegate to an Article 5 convention would ever vote for a COS fiscal restraints amendment or a BBA, knowing their state would lose a huge portion of their state revenues. Of course, the BBA would require taxes to be raised and for balanced budget restraints to be set aside in case of an emergency. COS tells us that the only answer to America's problems is an Article 5 convention, but there are other answers. Elections are one, and recently states have begun to push back against federal bullying. Texas is a prime example. They have passed laws to deal in their state with the massive illegal immigration invasion. The state of Texas has also established a bullion depository so citizens can store their precious metals, and along with Tennessee and Utah have made gold and silver legal tender as allowed in the United States Constitution under Article 1, Section 10. This will be a protection. The American people are waking up because of the invasion at the border, bankrupt education, inflation, COVID lockdown and vax, and the stolen election. An Article 5 Constitutional Convention is the worst answer for our nation's problems. All the states in the Union will be participants. As our longtime Eagle Shirley Spellerberg said, that's downright scary to consider putting our sacred Constitution in the hands of compromised and corrupt politicians who are supposed to fix it. You can bet the first thing to go would be our right to keep and bear arms. Next, our freedom of religion, freedom of speech and assembly. We must reject the Article 5 Constitutional Convention of the states. Thank you.
Thank you, Janine. That was awesome. Gail, we've got you next.
So I was going to talk about, different ways in which to go out and reach our friends and try to get to maybe people that have been supporting an Article 5 convention for years and find a place in where we can work together. And one of them was Glenn Beck. He for 10 years was a supporter of an Article 5 convention, and he was willing to sit down with me for an hour and give me an opportunity to share with him my feelings and thoughts on this. He was great about it. He asked questions, but he was very positive about it. Grabbed my notes when I got through and said he would think about it, pray about it, and let me know. And the very next day he announced this is what he said. And thanks to Uni, who just absolutely, went back and transcribed this. But he says, I have been a supporter of the Article 5 Convention of States. I have been a pretty big supporter, a vocal supporter. I'm reversing that today because after some real thoughts and prayers, we are not that people to open up this sacred document. We are not that people. That was a God-inspired document that was divinely written. You can read that from, I don't know how many founders. The very hand of God was involved. Ben Franklin even said, and this is still going quoting, the very hand of God was involved in writing that document. Do you believe that we could send that kind of delegate today? Someone who, when they got to an impasse, someone like Ben Franklin would say, let's go pause and go to church and pray. They did not politic, they prayed. I'm not for opening up the Constitution anymore because we are not that people anymore. When we are that people, I will be for it. Again, when we have demonstrated our humility and our obedience to God, and I'm afraid it's going to take a massive beat down of our country to get to that place, then I'll be for it again. Someday we'll be humble enough. We will recognize God, but someday we will not be an enemy to God. We will not be so arrogant. When we are those people, I'll support the Convention of States. But I withdraw my support, and I am sorry to say that it's because of the fact that this Constitution is wholly inadequate for anyone other than a righteous and moral people. We are not those people, and we should not stain this document. And of course, he was really what he was talking about there was John Adams, who said our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It's wholly inadequate to the government, any other. And another person who did the same thing after years and years of supporting an Article 5 convention was Cleon Skousen. And when Cleon changed his mind, he said that in a letter to Phyllis. And this in that letter was this paragraph. In all these years, you and I have only divided on one issue. And as time passes, my feeling is that while I was right on the abstract constitutional principle, you were undoubtedly right on sensing a greater danger if we tried to apply an Article 5 of the Constitution during a period of the most depraved political corruption in the entire history of our country. In any effect, you won, and I am grateful when the heavenly powers pushes events in a direction which ultimately serves the divine purpose of our great nation's manifest destiny. You know, and if you look at that, he said that back in 1994 when he said that this was the most corrupt time in our entire history. I actually took this letter to Glenn Beck, and he's a big supporter and loves Cleon Skousen. And that really helped him to think this through. And so as I, have worked on this and thought about it, now I know that there are some people who are really upset and say, hey, I don't like what Glenn Beck said, and I don't like what Cleon said, because I didn't say, we should never have one. But, if we can find people that will come and join with us and oppose an Article 5 convention, regardless of what their reasons are, as Phil has always said, you can vote for the candidate of my choice for any reason you choose. And I think that's what we have to be looking at here, that if we've got people who you can say to, now is not the time. But, just like they said, I mean, I think Glenn said it so strongly, we're, when we're a righteous people again, well, whether that'll ever happen, we don't know. But I think that is a place where we can come together and meet together, and we can make a huge difference in bringing other people together and convincing legislators. Getting Glenn back on our side was really, really one of the most important things we could do on this issue. A couple of other things that I want to mention is that one of the things we hear all the time is that people say, well, nothing bad can happen because it's going to take 3/4 of the states to ratify. But what they're not telling you in all of this, that's 38 states. And out of those 38 states, it only takes 50%, and in most cases, it's legislators, 50% plus one of the legislators of the state to ratify any proposed amendment. So like I'm looking here in the state of Utah, our legislature only has to get 50 plus one to say we'll be one of those 38 states. So it's not just 38% of the people, 50% of the people, 50% of the legislators can actually vote to have us ratify an amendment. And you look at these things, and what are some of the things that they could talk about? Well, the COS bill that's being passed in all the states, has 3 categories. And one of the categories is limit the powers and jurisdiction of the federal government. Well, to begin with, I thought that's what the Constitution was about. But if you think about those categories and the kinds of things that could come up in those categories, like marriage equality, I really think in the state of Utah right now, if there was a marriage equality amendment, that they could get enough of our legislators to vote yes on marriage equality, because they're saying, oh, well, we have gay marriage anyway. What difference does it make? And if a state of Utah would support something like that, like I say, they just need 50%. What about abortion? What happened in Kansas and what we see happening in other states now? The Equal Rights Amendment. Who do you know nowadays in today's world is that would stand up and vote no on the Equal Rights Amendment because it scares them? Well, I'm for equal rights. I can't vote no on that. So again, conservative states that we think are going to be with us in a convention, these are the things they could pass. And like Janine was talking about, Second Amendment. Well, one of the things that I think they could pass easily is getting rid of assault weapons. But what is the definition of an assault weapon? The definition of an assault weapon could be whatever they say it is. Any gun that shoots somebody is an assault. So I look at the states that we have now, and I think that there are so many unbelievable things that would be passed in those states. And I can show these things right here in our state and talk to our legislators, and they have to admit, as they look around the floor and the colleagues and most of them are all Republicans, how many of them would vote for these very things that I just showed you? And I'm sure there are all kinds of lists on that. So I think these are other reasons that we can bring forward and how we can talk to these people. But please use this information from those who have changed their mind and said, now is not the time. We can say now is not the time. I say that to people, now is not the time. And it's a friendly way to bring people together and a way for others who you know, they can save face. They can save face when they say now is not the time. You know, someday I'll be back. They can save face by saying the reason I thought we should do this in the first place is because I thought we could pass something decent. Now I know that we can't. Now is not the time.
Thank you, Gail. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Orlean, you're next.
Thank you. It's an honor to be with you. I would like to thank these three wonderful women who went before me because they've had a great influence on my life, understanding this whole issue. I wanted to let you know that each of them have come and spoken for our Eagle Forum events here in California. We always have a Constitution Day celebration that we've been doing for the past 23 years, and Article 5 is often one of our topics. So we've had Judy speak for us. We've had Gail. In fact, Gail was our last speaker last September, and we've had Janine, and they've always brought wonderful information. I got started with my interest in this subject was because I read an article by Mark Meckler maybe 15 years ago, where he accused Phyllis Schlafly of not being a constitutional attorney and knowing nothing about the Constitution. So of course that got my dander up, and I was really furious, and I wrote a rebuttal article to him and said that she actually graduated from George Washington University in St. Louis, the top of her class. She's a brilliant scholarship, constitutional scholar, and she probably was writing about the Constitution when Mark Meckler was back in diapers. And then, since Mark Meckler is from Northern California, I know his history. He went to a law school that was probably rating in the 200th category rather than something as high as Phyllis. So anyway, I started writing more and more about it. And as usual, whenever I start an article, it usually ends up as a book. And so that's what I now have. This is my book that's called America Needs Revival, Not Revision: The Dangers and Risks of an Article 5 Convention of the States. And I would like to thank Janine and Judy for so much information that they sent to me. I have so many of the articles in there that Phyllis wrote about it. And their articles, they both are wonderful writers. I would just like to say that the reasons that I am so opposed to this are mainly three, and you've heard some of these already presented. I'm just trying to get my writings to come up on my screen. There it is. Okay. So first of all, I wanted to say that I am really concerned about the limiting the power and jurisdiction of the Constitution, because that's what the COS group is saying. That's why they want their articles to be included, their amendments. When Judy and I spoke before our legislators here in California, when they were trying to bring in a COS resolution, not even the judicial legislation group wanted to limit the power and jurisdiction of the Constitution, because that's what the Constitution is all about. The whole Constitution would have to be opened up and rewritten if that were to happen. And so they didn't even allow it to go through the first committee, which was the Judicial Committee. Then my second argument is we have a divinely inspired Constitution, as so many of our presenters have said, but we have elected officials who are not abiding by it. Therefore, we have to change the Constitution to get them to abide by it. What proof do we have that they will abide by the new amendments, since they're not abiding by the present ones? It is like saying we have a perfectly good Bible inspired by God, but since we have people who do not abide by the Bible, therefore we need to add to and change the Bible. I use that argument on Shannon Grove, who is one of our favorite Republican legislators here in California. She had been asked by David Barton to bring in the COS amendments and ask for this resolution. And when I gave her that argument, she said, you know, that's the best I've heard against this. And she actually pulled her resolution, and it was not submitted. So I think that's a really good argument. And then I really love what Glenn Beck said, and I'm so thankful for Gail and her talking to him and being able to influence him, because that truly is what is the truth. We do not have the same kind of of really religious men that we had back at the time of the Constitution and when it was first presented. And I'm so glad that Glenn Beck said this, and I'd just like to say it again. We are not the people to open up this sacred document, and we are not. And then the last chapter of my book is a scenario, and I actually portray what this convention would look like. I have various people who are coming so excited about it, and as they arrive, they notice, we thought this was just going to be a convention for our viewpoint and the nice conservatives who are part of the COS group. No, there was a huge, vast group of liberals mainly. And as Janine has said, California would be there in great number to support their Second Amendment changes that they want. And large numbers of liberals were there. And then the convention starts, and little by little, these conservatives who arrived from Arizona, who were so excited, see how this was so carefully set up. Little by little, all of the amendments that were presented by liberals are presented, because of course, with the present woke society that we are in, of diversity, inclusion, Congress would not limit any of these amendments because all would be included. And so at the end of my book, I would just like to share this with you. The reporter who's interviewing the people who came in, Mary, Richard, and John, and he said, he explains how everyone is leaving. People have tears in their eyes because they've essentially now lost their constitution. A new constitution has been voted in because they were able to change all of the rules, and in one day's time, everything had changed. And he says, watching this procession of people is almost like watching people leaving a funeral. Many have tears streaming down their faces. Sorry, I got really teary-eyed when I wrote this. I get the same when I'm reading it, as they begin to realize they just participated and helped in the demise of the greatest nation that has ever been upon the face of the earth. The beacon of liberty, the shining light on the hill, is no more. In a matter of minutes, the goals of those who have been plotting for years to throw out our Constitution, to destroy our United States of America, to get rid of our states and put us under regional government, to disarm us and to put us under an all-powerful world government, have just been accomplished. Even our elections have just been stopped. Those on both the left and the right who have been actively promoting an ABC for years, thinking they were involved in something wonderful to help save the Constitution and the nation, now hang their heads in shame, realizing they have been duped. As the people are filing out, they are shocked to see the armed UN soldiers on both sides, wearing their blue helmets that have now replaced what were local police officers when they first entered the convention hall. Here are the three people I interviewed at the beginning of the convention, Mary, Richard, and John. May I ask how you are feeling now at the end of this historical day? Mary says, it is the saddest day of my life. I am so sorry that I was ever a part of this. And Richard says, we are embarrassed and ashamed to think that we were duped into being here, that we took part in helping to destroy the greatest nation and form of government and greatest constitution that has ever been realized on the face of the earth. We now realize that the convention was the globalist plan for the beginning, and much stealth and deception has gone into the preparation for this day. If only this day had never been allowed to take place. The reporter then says, in great sorrow, Bob, Mary, and John walk away from the convention. Mary is crying. So many women are crying as they file out. They and millions of Americans are now facing a future and an America that will never be the same. What a difference one day can make. I echo John's words, if only this day had never been allowed to take place. Thank you for letting me share that.
Thank you, Orleen. That's wonderful. Let's go now to Elaine Donnelly.
Chris, thank you so much for scheduling the meeting. And I want to express personal thanks. Janine Hansen and Gail and Arlene and Judy Kaler and others have been working on this issue for so long. I appreciate everybody's hard work. State after state, big money up against you. uninformed, well-meaning but uninformed people to have to deal with. It's a very frustrating fight. And I've been interested in this issue for more than 30 years. I formed CMR, Center for Military Readiness, in 1993. But even before then, I was following Phyllis's lead and very strongly opposed to this idea of calling a convention supposedly to rewrite the Constitution when, well, the Constitution is not the problem. It's violating the Constitution that is the problem. I'm very sorry that Professor Woodruff could not be here today. Let me tell you a little bit about him. He is a patriot. I've known him for almost 30 years. He's a retired colonel in the Army, a constitutional law professor. I am a student in the law school of Professor William Woodruff. I've learned so much from him. But in talking to him about this topic a couple of years ago, he and I both realized we didn't have a solid law review article that would address this subject. So he wrote it on his own. Nobody paid him to do it. It's in the Charleston Law Review, and Eagle Forum will send you a link to it. This is a hard copy. There are some hard copies if you want to give one to a legislature. He covers all of the historic stuff. He read the Robert Nailson materials about history and the constitutional conventions of the states. And he said, this is bunk. He said, it's full of holes. And I encouraged him to write about it, and he did. And we kind of collaborated to make sure that anybody can use this Law Journal article, even though it's written with a legal perspective, anybody can use it. And the 5-page summary that Eagle Forum has available with a 6-page for the footnotes is a summary of that Law Journal article. So I recommend that you take a look at that. My contribution to this whole thing is the political part of it, because I wrote 2 articles for the Federalist, and I asked a very simple question. If conservatives can't control what Congress is doing now, what makes them think they could control a constitutional convention? When you think about it, it makes no sense at all. Because as Arlene just said, when someone said, oh, I thought only us good conservatives would be there because conservatives are calling the convention, so it would be for us, right? How naive, well-meaning, but so naive. Because how many in this group, and I'm sure there's others who are not, their faces showing here, we have been to conventions. Most of the leaders of the Convention of States project, highly paid, okay, they have no experience with conventions. If you look at their bios, certainly not contested conventions. They never went through what many of us went through with the International Women's Year conferences. Remember, we came home feeling like battered women. You can lose all your rights with one crack of a gavel. We have been to national Republican conventions, cycle after cycle after cycle. We've been delegates, we've been on platform committee. We know how tough conventions can be. Now, if there were a convention called, do you think, anybody who thinks that the Nancy Pelosi crowd would stay on the outside and say, oh, isn't that cute? The conservatives are having a convention. We'll just watch and it'll be fine. No, they would rush in and they would be well-financed. What inspired me to write the articles for the Federalist was the book by Molly Hemingway called Rigged. It was about the presidential elections in 2020. Those state elections weren't really stolen. It's impossible to prove stolen after the fact. They were rigged ahead of time. And Molly did a brilliant job in tracking the Zuck bucks, how many, let's see, 140 some million that was spent making sure that delegates took care of certain thing, or election officials sent out ballots to people without being asked. The counting procedures, the state laws were violated. There were lawsuits brought, and the lawsuits were useless because the courts wouldn't even take them up. They were told they didn't have standing. I have experience with this personally in my own state of Michigan. In 1988, we had what turned out to be the Wars of '88. It was a split convention. We had different factions, conservatives over here, George H.W. Bush and Mary Madeline over there. We had battles in county after county after county. State laws were violated. We went to court. We lost in the first round. Mary Madeline slammed that down. She said, Elaine, you lost. Guess what? We won the case. But by the time we won the case, the convention, the national convention, was already over with. My point is, anybody who counts on the courts to straighten out irregularities, or if expectations are not met for a convention to propose amendments, they're kidding themselves. The courts will not get involved any more than they got involved in the elections of 2020. So the first thing that anybody, I think, has to deal with when in talking to someone who's in favor of this is ask the musical question: what makes you think conservatives would be in charge? And secondly, when things go awry, what are you going to do to fix it? Oh, well, you got to have 38 states to ratify. Oh, and how are you going to do that? And who's going to control that process? There's a lot of money involved. Anybody who's been to national conventions, you know it's expensive, right? So if there's money, and there's a ton of money for the Convention of States project as it is, imagine the money that would pour in so that the leftist delegates predominate. And they can. I mean, we're talking about rules, we're talking about credentials, we're talking about issues to be discussed, voting on amendments, voting on proposals to go out to the states at every single stage of a convention to propose amendments. Nothing is guaranteed. Everything would be up to the delegates. At the same time all this is going on, we could be losing the elections that really do count. And it's not just this next one coming up, which is so important, the presidential race, the state Senate races, or the senators from the states, the congressional races that are so important. While people are trying to vie to go to a convention to propose amendments, competing with the big money people, how do you think that's going to turn out? All I'm saying is, let's use a little bit of common sense here. Here's another example. When the almost unheard of procedure of replacing the speaker was tried last year, remember how tumultuous that was? Well, it never had been done before, but a few conservative delegates decided they wanted to replace Kevin McCarthy as speaker. Okay, so they started that process. They opened the Pandora's box. I watched while Mark Levin on his program was fuming at the mouth. He was spitting at nails because the conservatives were causing so much turmoil. He was very opposed to that whole process. And I think Mike Johnson is a terrific guy. My husband even predicted ultimately he would win. But did we really need to go through that process? Has it made that much difference? My point is, Mark Levin was totally helpless to do anything about that convention once it got started, okay, or that voting process within Congress, which was a limited universe. Imagine all the different states having these CPA, whatever meetings they are, whether they're delegated or appointed, members of Congress get involved. Nancy Pelosi wants to chair the convention. I get the feeling that some people just want to be the next founding father. I'll just close with this. If we imagine a national convention with both political parties in the same room at the same time, and we expect something good to come out of it under the glare of media, you are really kidding yourselves, folks. And I think the practical political arguments should be used as regular as possible. All the testimonials from before are always important too, but looking to the future, this whole thing makes no sense. And again, I want to thank everybody who's held the line on this for a long time. The one question I don't want to see us have to ask, like Orlean was saying, how the women were getting emotional after that meeting, how do we get our Constitution back? We can't afford to let that question have to be asked. And again, thank you for inviting me to talk.
Thank you, Elaine. Now we'd like to open up the floor for questions. I know it's a lot of information, and I just want to thank our presenters for such a thorough job. You know, this is a topic that we could talk about for hours, literally. So I want to thank everyone for being so concise, but I know if you're listening, it seems like a lot of things were just thrown at you. So Janine, I see your hand is up. Do you have a question or a comment?
I appreciated what Gail said about her concerns about the 38 states that they tout that will be able to stop any bad amendment. I think, first of all, we need to look at the 16th and 17th amendments that the states already passed. And the other thing we need to realize is in the end of Article 5, the only thing in the Constitution that can't be amended is the fact that every state has 2 senators. And so during a constitutional convention, they can even amend the amending process, which could change that 38 states, like they did in the original constitutional convention, changing it from unanimous under the Articles of Confederation to just 9 states. So I think that's something we need to be aware of, that 38 states is not a safeguard considering what they've done in the past, the states. And
Right.
Gail outlined that very well.
Judy, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I want to go back to the last question too. I can't figure out how to raise your hand on this. But yes, anything could be the ratification process. That is the problem. There is precedent for that. And the framers all agreed that they had exceeded the commissions that they had for the convention. What they disagreed, and the convention lobby will tell you that they were actually commissioned to rewrite the Constitution, which isn't true. What they disagreed on is whether they should go forward with a new Constitution. And James Madison justified what they did in, I think it was Federalist 40, by saying that they had that power, because referred to the Declaration of Independence. So yes, it could be a national popular vote. The voting machines could ratify this for us. It could be the signature of a president. It could be anything. That is not a safeguard. And I also wanted to say that a lot of these endorsements are paid for, but there are tens of millions of dollars flowing from, well, I know the Convention of States, but the other groups have lots of money too that is funding this. We don't know who the backers are. They're undisclosed. They don't have to disclose. So when you get into, what is generating endorsements, whether it's paid advertising on their programs, whether it's jumping on the bandwagon of their friends, we don't know what it is, because we only see the top 5 big donations when it comes out to where they're spending their money. So we don't know. So
Thank you. Let's go to Cindy before we run out of time.
Okay, so I put in the chat a link to the mock convention that they recently did. It was their second one, and I've been starting to listen to that at night. And at the beginning, 3 of them, Ferris, Meckler, and Santorum, are sitting down and a lady's interviewing them, and she says, "How do you feel now that it's actually starting?" And the 3 of them say one by one, "Well, a little nervous, because we've given them their structure. We've gotten them here. We've, given them their rules. And now they're going to take it from here." So they completely undermine themselves, that like Congress isn't going to do this, because they are not going to set up those rules. They're not going to set up the structure. Congress is going to. And they deny that, but they say it right there on tape within the first hour of their show, that we set this up. We're the ones setting this up. So we have created the rules and the structure, but we don't know what they're going to do with it. To me, that just implodes their entire arguments for a convention. And so anyway, I wanted you to have
shows the uncertainty and the vulnerability in this, that even the people who are pretending to do it don't even know how it's going to come out. And so the idea that it will all turn out okay is they can't say it in their play acting version of it. Are there any other questions before we wrap it up, or do we need to? Oh, wait, Orlean's got. Yes, very good.
I wanted to also add that in my scenario, it was so easy for them, since they essentially now have gotten rid of all of the rules, to say, we're not really going to send this out for ratification to the states. We're going to make the decision right here. All those in favor of voting to ratify everything we've done right here within our assembly, within our convention, please say aye. And in just a matter of a few minutes, this had totally changed, just like it had with the original Constitution when it was first being proposed by our wonderful founding fathers. But the liberals, of course, took over. And I think that is how they would have this planned. There are so many groups who want to do away with our Constitution. And I think it was it Judy who said they have 6 new forms of a Constitution to come in? In my scenario, they adopted the new state's Constitution that puts us under 10 big regional governments. All of our states were now done away with. Congress was done away with. All of the congressmen who were there were absolutely flabbergasted that they had just lost their positions. So anything can happen, and that's what we need to realize, how dangerous this is.
Yes, and for those of you who don't know, the new state's constitution was something that was pushed in the 1980s, I believe. It was an idea that some people had to actually redo our system of government. So let me go to Kathy Wilmot. I see Janine as well, but let's start with Kathy.
Okay, this is just off the U.S. Constitution, but a year ago in our Republican Party here in Nebraska, it took one amendment to totally turn our GOP Constitution on its head, and we have had nothing but strife ever since and total disconnectedness. So when you think about amendments too, they're going to argue that, oh, this is limited. Well, I say it's not. But even if it is, you come up with the right amendment, you can just unravel the whole thing. And that is very fearful to me.
Very good point. Janine, and then Elaine.
Just a practical point. This is the legislative season right now. If you're in a state where there's any possibility for rescission, even if you don't think you can get it through, it takes up their time in doing it. They have some key states like Idaho that they've targeted, and Michigan is another one. We need to be aware that right now is a season that we can be engaged in doing these things. And there are the most important thing that we can do is rescind, and to keep states like Idaho that have previously rescinded all of their Article 5s from passing it again. So there are some real practical things that we can do right now in getting involved in opposing this.
Excellent. Elaine?
Yes, the argument that this is a good time to do this because there's more control by conservatives of state legislatures. Explain to me what happened in Michigan and in Ohio when abortion referenda were put out there to the voters, overwhelmingly improved, wiping out all the good state laws that had been put in place prior to that. The political dynamics are not favoring conservatives right now. Our country is divided. And to put all your eggs into this kind of a vague hope, it's just foolish.
Gail and Judy.
I just want to mention that sometimes we don't think about how all of us need to be involved and be very concerned about what's happening in other states. Normally we think, well, this is our state, we work hard on our own state, but this particular issue, we've got to care about every single state, because whether our state has passed it or not, we'll be thrown into a convention by what goes on in other states.
Excellent. Judy?
I just want to say that the argument that I think proves what we're saying is correct is that there is already a call for a convention. It's been around for a year and a half, but this is the current call for a convention, is H-Con Res 24 in Congress. It doesn't pretend to limit the convention. It's based on every application since 1788, aggregating them, including rescinded applications. And they are trying to fool Congress. These are the same people who are saying what we said at the state level. They're trying to fool Congress into thinking they're passing a convention, a call for a convention about fiscal responsibility. And it's in black and white, and it's only 3.5 pages. And that could be used to talk to people too. We're in a public relations war right now.
Right, that's correct. I just want to conclude with another quote by Phyllis. And she said this is back in 1984, any lawyer can give his opinion on what the Article 5 procedure can be or should be, but no lawyer, no matter how distinguished, can tell us what it surely will be, because nobody knows. No law exists to prescribe rules for the Article 5 convention, and even if Congress passes one now, we would never know its constitutionality until it is reviewed by the Supreme Court, if it is in fact reviewed by the Supreme Court. There is the HCon Res 24 in Congress that calls for Congress to recognize the calls and to set up the Article 5 convention. I have been talking to the leaders of the House Freedom Caucus and others, and merely said, because the House Freedom Caucus is split on this, some of them support it, some of them don't. I've merely said, this is a very contentious issue. At this point, in 2024, we need to be united. We do not need to be bringing up issues that divide the conservative movement. And this is an issue. And when I said that to the Scott Perry, who just stepped down from being the chairman of the House Freedom Caucus, he said, oh, I don't want to bring up anything that's going to divide the conservative movement, no matter how I feel about it, because they understand that this is, they have to understand that this is not something that unites our side of the aisle. So when you're talking to your federal legislators, let them know that should they go down this path, they're not just picking a fight with the other side, but they're actually picking a fight with some of their friends. And it's at this time when we're fighting to keep children from being mutilated. Do you think those people are not going to seek an amendment to protect the right to mutilate children? Absolutely they are. We can't even win on these most basic issues. It is not the time to be opening up our Constitution, because the other side, even if they say they hate it, they will be there, and they will have the mainstream media and everybody else pushing what they want to have, which is abortion on demand, genital mutilation of children, taking away guns. These are the priorities of the left, and they will use any opportunity they can, even if we open the door, to get their agenda passed. So I encourage you to talk to people who have never heard of this before too. Even in Washington, I have friends who are involved in the conservative politics. And I said, have you ever heard of this issue where we'd use Article 5 to have a new, a convention for proposing amendments? And they look at me and they say, oh no, that's a terrible idea. So the people who haven't heard of it have a gut reaction that we are not living in the time and not living with the people who are capable of making the changes necessary. We have a constitution. We need to get our elected officials to follow it. We don't need to be changing the 10 commandments and hoping they'll follow it then, because that's definitely not a prescription for success. So I want to thank everyone for being on this Zoom meeting, and we'd love your feedback, and we will provide you with more and more materials, probably more materials than you have time to read, but we encourage you to join us in this fight and to reach out if you have any other questions. Thank you very much.